In this video, I will go through a couple of deck building choices I made when building this version of Nic Fit that I've been uploading a couple of games of. Now, this is a fairly complicated process and I'm not able to discuss every aspect of every decision, but I hope at least it brings some motivation as to why I'm building this deck and why it looks like it does. Now, if you have any questions, you're very welcome to write comments here in the YouTube comment section or on Discord or in the source, for example. The first thing I want to mention when looking at this deck is that I based this off of one of the 4-color Vial decks I've been playing. Now, why would you do that, and why is that a good starting point? Well, basically, the Vial is a card that provides your deck with a lot of extra mana for casting creatures, and Nic Fit also is a deck that wants to generate extra mana to play different spells, for example, creatures. And since I noticed that in the other Vial deck, you never run out of steam, you have so much card advantage and interaction, I felt like that's a really good starting point for making a good Nic Fit deck, because Nic Fit can very easily ramp into some powerful, expensive threats, and then it kind of dies because it doesn't find enough interaction, it doesn't top deck well. So having a deck that's full of interaction and creatures with card advantage on them, it really makes for a good starting point of what could be a good Nic Fit deck. So basically, the changes you want to make when going from an Other Vial deck to a Nic Fit deck, or from a Nic Fit deck to an Other Vial deck, is you don't want to remove the interaction or the action of the deck. You kind of don't want to remove the creatures, the counter spells, the discard, but you do want to change the support cards. So the support cards for the Other Vial deck are basically Other Vial and Recruiter of the Guard. They are the cards that let the Vial deck operate the way it wants to. Recruiter of the Guard lets you find whatever one-off you put in the deck to solve a specific situation, and the Other Vial allows you to cast your creatures at instant speed, and also to generate the extra mana you need to play this extra tutor. Now for Nic Fit, the support cards are Green Sun Zenith, Cabal Therapy, and Veteran Explorer, because Green Sun Zenith finds whatever creature you need, and also lets you play one-offs, of course. And then you need Cabal Therapy to enable getting the mana, which kind of makes it similar to Other Vial in one way. They are all the support cards that define the environment that these decks want to operate in. So by simply changing the core cards of the Nic Fit deck, Green Sun Zenith, Cabal Therapy, and Veteran Explorer, to the support cards of the Other Vial deck, Other Vial and Recruiter of the Guard, we can jump between these two types of decks, and depending on which strategy we want to emphasize in our deck. And the strategy that made me change from Vial to Nic Fit now, this time, was that I really want to see how good I can make Recurring Nightmare be. Recurring Nightmare does not synergize well with Other Vial, because the mana you get from Other Vial can't be used to cast a Recurring Nightmare. However, Recurring Nightmare does fit very well in a Nic Fit deck, because the more mana you get, the more times you can use Recurring Nightmare every turn. Now, Recurring Nightmare works really well with all the creatures that are typically in a Vial deck, because they all provide value when they enter the battlefield, or you just want to bring them back into play if the opponent answers them. Like, for example, Leovold. If the opponent answers your Leovold, you're really happy to be able to bring it back with Recurring Nightmare. So the basic thought of this deck is kind of, I play the game with my opponent, you interact with them, you play the 4 forces. If they try to do something very powerful, you try to force it, and maybe you cast an early Grief, an Evoke Grief if it's a combo deck, or you play it slowly at 4 mana to take away their threats if you can, or their interaction, and you clear the way with Cabal Therapy. Then when you need to in the game, you can Green Sun Zenith for Meren, which brings back creatures from your graveyard that you already used, for example a Solitude or a Grief. It's a pretty nice, almost a combo. You can bring back Icefang Quattle if you blocked your opponent. You can bring back Orcish Bowmaster, for example. So the Meren provides a lot of value, and it doesn't synergize with Recruiter of the Guard. It does synergize, however, with Green Sun Zenith. And you can also Green Sun Zenith for Eternal Witness to bring something back. And now, while you're interacting a lot with the opponent with this deck, you tend to end up in a top decking battle with your opponent. And when you do, if you draw Recurring Nightmare at that point, that's usually going to be a fairly quick win from there, I believe. Especially because a couple of Recurring Nightmare with Eternal Witness, which you can tutor for with Green Sun Zenith, you get, for 3 mana, you get to bring back any card from your graveyard to your hand. So you get to very quickly refill your hand with Swords to Plowshares, and forces and whatever creature you may want, other removal as well, and hate bears. Another nice aspect of Recurring Nightmare is that the cycling monsters we have for finding lands, they get to be brought back basically for free once you hit the Recurring Nightmare, and if the opponent answers them, you can keep bringing them back again and again. A nice aspect of this grinding engine, I consider these cards to be kind of a grinding engine, Marin, Recurring Nightmare, and Eternal Witness, is that suppose you're top decking with the opponent, or maybe you're still fighting the resource game with them. You green sun it for Marin, they have to answer it immediately, or else you start bringing back a creature every turn. Now once they answer it, hopefully they don't exile it, but if they do exile it, then this doesn't work, right? But if they don't exile it but answer it in another way, like with discard or some removal or counterspell, then you get to green sun it for Eternal Witness to bring back the Marin to your hand. And then you can play Marin again, and hopefully you can find a way to get rid of the Witness, perhaps with Therapy, and then Marin brings back Witness to your hand. So if they answer Marin again, then you can bring Marin back to your hand. And then as you keep drawing cards and top decking, maybe you find Recurring Nightmare. And they can use Recurring Nightmare with Witness also to bring back Marin, for example. Seems like if you're in a grindy game, these three cards will have decent synergy to bring each other back to help you grind out games. Now, if opponent, for example, has many creatures in play that are threatening you, you can use Witness plus Nightmare or Marin to bring back Solitude to exile all the creatures. You can Recurring Nightmare Solitude back in without Witness, of course, to just exile a card every other time you use Recurring Nightmare. You can similarly bring back Bowmasters for pinging. You can bring back Iceland Quattle to have more blockers. You can bring back Night of Autumn to destroy several artifacts and enchantments. You can bring back Grist also for destroying creatures. You can bring back Skyfisher Spider to destroy any non-land permanent. Another small synergy that I'm really eager to try in this list to evaluate if it can help make Nic Fit decks better is Teferi Time Raveller with Cabal Therapy or Grief. So basically, in the past when I played Nic Fit, I feel like Cabal Therapy is a very good spell if your opponent doesn't have Brainstorm to hide cards from their hand and doesn't have very many cantrips. Because if they don't, you can use Therapy with a flashback to get rid of your opponent's threats, leaving them in a top deck game earlier than yourself. Now, if you play Teferi Time Raveller, then effectively the opponent will not be able to stop you from stripping their hand of their threats or cantrips or whatever they have. So I feel like Teferi is a really good shutdown of Brainstorm specifically. Now, in addition to that, Cabal Therapy is a dead card in the late game, and I think Nic Fit as a deck really suffers from having the main cards of its engine, or the deck-defining cards, Therapy and Veteran Explorer, they are essentially dead cards when you draw them at the end of a game. So that's an inherent disadvantage that could be compensated for with Teferi, because when you play Teferi in the late game, and suppose you have a Cabal Therapy in the graveyard and the creature sacrifice, you use the Teferi bounce to bounce one of your opponent's threats to their hand. Then you can use the flashback of Therapy as a removal spell. And you can remove anything this way as long as you can bounce it. So, for example, it answers the One Ring. So this brings a lot of flexibility in making sure that you can destroy everything at the late game, and almost everything, not True Name Nemesis. And you can also use your discard in the late game. There's also a tutor here that's worth commenting on, and that's Spellseeker. Can green sun it for Fiend Artisan. Fiend Artisan finds anything, so it also finds the Spellseeker. Now, I don't expect to actually do that very often, but the Spellseeker in itself seems quite useful just as a tutor you can draw. Because with Spellseeker, you can tutor for Rite of Oblivion, which is one of the cards I'm eager to experiment with to see if it's useful. Rite of Oblivion lets you... It's kind of like a Cabal Therapy, which doesn't discard, but rather it exiles any permanent from the opponent. So you get to exile 2 spells with it. So it's kind of powerful when you can fit 2 removal spells into one. So I want to try that and see how good it is. So and you can actually sacrifice the Spellseeker body to the Rite of Oblivion. So there's kind of a little bit of synergy there as well. You can also Spellseeker for Dam. Dam is a spot removal when you need it, but it's also a sweeper when you need it. And Nic Fit tends to like having access to sweepers because it's a control deck that sets up a bit slowly. You can tutor for Brainstorm, is also always useful. you can brainstorm for Therapy and have a body for it, so it makes Spellseeker function kind of like a Hymtoturak, kind of, when coupled with a Therapy. You can Spellseeker for Reanimate, if you want to bring back, for example, one of the trolls or the ants. I expect that some of these cards will be more useful than others, and with time I will be changing this list, of course. But right now I don't see any cards that are obvious cuts. And I have played kind of this configuration of cards for a long time in the Vial decks, and they are usually all very useful. So, and the ability to tutor for them or tutor for a tutor that tutor for them. So it's helpful for you because it gives you unparalleled agency in a game, but it also makes it more difficult for the opponent to know what they can expect from you. It makes it more difficult for them to sideboard against you. One thing I'm considering with this list is if I should perhaps have a little bit more of a top end here to Green Sun Zenith for. There is the generous end, which you can potentially Green Sun Zenith for if you didn't already cycle it. And if you did cycle it, you can bring it back with Meren, Nightmare, or Witness. But I think it would be probably a good idea to bring in a green 5 or 6 drop, and especially I'm thinking of Titania, Protector of Orgoth, which is always my favorite green finisher pretty much. But Titania is best when you have some cards that allow you to sacrifice a couple of lands or to put several 5/3 tokens into play with her to finish the game very quickly. One way is to play Sylvan Safekeeper, and another way is to play Knight of the Reliquary. Now, Knight of the Reliquary is my preferred choice there because it's a very useful card by itself. It's a 3 mana, usually a very large creature for 3 mana, and it provides an additional tutoring layer to the deck. And especially having always access to Knight of the Reliquary through your Green Sun Zeniths means that you also always have access to Karakas, and being able to tutor up Karakas in every game is usually extremely relevant. And this allows you to set up a state where you can put Knight of the Reliquary into play, put Leovold into play, and if the opponent tries to get rid of it, you can tap Knight, fetch Karakas, and bounce the Leovold to recast it next turn. Also, Sylvan Safekeeper does have quite a lot less synergy with the deck. Almost all of your creatures are expendable, so you don't really want to protect them with a Safekeeper. And second of all, your deck is trying to put more lands into play, so you don't really want to sacrifice the lands until you're in a winning position. So I prefer to play Knight of the Reliquary, but I didn't make space for it at this point. I decided to play Questing Beast as my attacker of choice here to Green Sun Zenith for, because Titania requires more setup. And also I think it's quite valuable to have a creature with a haste in the deck that can attack and put up some pressure on control decks. And I'm not sure if it's so important, but I also like that it can attack through the One Ring triggers. I want to comment on why there's only one Veteran Explorer in the list. And as I commented on before in this video, one of Nic Fit's major problems, I believe, is that it has many dead top decks in the late game, and it usually doesn't have much library manipulation. So you kind of want to keep the amount of Cabal Therapies and Veteran Explorers to a minimum to avoid losing in a top deck battle. Like, imagine playing a deck that tries to get to a top deck state, and then when you get to a top deck state, it's worse than the opponent's deck at executing that game plan. So I only put one Veteran Explorer in the list. You don't really need to get the 2 extra basics to play this deck, because there are plenty of cards that allow you to draw into lands naturally. So that's why there's only one Veteran Explorer. And of course there are 4 Green Sun Zeniths that allow you to tutor for it. Also, you rarely need 2 triggers from a Veteran Explorer during a game. If you get 2 Veteran Explorer triggers, that means you get 4 extra lands, and you probably already drew 3 to 4 lands, and that's more lands than you really need usually. But also in this list you can also use both Eternal Witness and Recurrent Nightmare to bring back Veteran into play if you need to get another trigger. Cabal Therapy is still played in 4 copies because you can't tutor for it. But however, I am trying to reduce how bad of a late game top deck it is, like I discussed, by adding Teferi Time Raveller to the deck. So that will be a very interesting experiment. As a final comment, the blue count is a bit low here, so I need to work on that. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and please drop any comments, I'm happy to hear it.